All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. We take those sources you send our way and get straight to the core of what you need to know. And today, we're going deep on a topic that's, well, it's kind of revolutionary. It's all about missions, and it all stems from this guy, Ralph D. Winter, and his 1974 address at the Lausanne Congress. The New Macedonia, he called it.
Yeah, Winter. Now that's a name that carries some weight in missiology, doesn't it? You sent over some fascinating material based on that speech, and I gotta say, the thing that really grabbed my attention right off the bat was his whole idea about how we think about spreading the gospel. Like, we need to go beyond just thinking about geography.
Right, right. We often talk about Christianity spreading all over the world, and yeah, on the map, it looks like it has churches on every continent, all that. But then you read a comment from someone like Donald McGavran, and it really hits you. I mean, he was talking about how way back in 1974, there were 2.7 billion people, 2.7 billion, who could only be reached if you were willing to cross these massive cultural and linguistic divides. It's almost like, well, like we're thinking about missions all wrong sometimes.
It really makes you reconsider the enormity of the task, that's for sure. And, this wasn't just some theory for Winter. I mean, the guy walked the walk, led the Frontier Mission Fellowship, spent years as a missionary with Mayan Indians in Guatemala, taught at Fuller Seminary. I mean, we're talking about someone who lived and breathed this stuff. Founded the U.S. Center for World Mission, too, right? And the William Carey International University.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So he knew what he was talking about, that's for sure. So for this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is really get to the heart of Winter's main argument. And basically what he believed was that if you want to truly fulfill the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, it means we need to completely rethink our approach and move towards what he called cross-cultural evangelism, not just planting churches in every country, but reaching all the different people groups within those countries. So let's start with the basics, I guess. What was the common way of thinking about the Great Commission back in 1974? Like, what was Winter pushing back against with this whole new perspective?
Well, the interesting thing is, a lot of evangelicals back then actually thought the Great Commission was pretty much done, like almost wrapped up. And, it wasn't a completely crazy idea. Winter himself admitted there were some, as he put it, wonderful facts that seemed to support that view. Like, yeah, the gospel had been preached to the ends of the earth. There were churches all over the place. Mission accomplished, right?
Right. Seems pretty logical, right? We've got churches everywhere. Everyone's heard the gospel. We're good. But Winter saw a huge problem with that, didn't he?
He did. He saw a massive missing piece of the puzzle. And this is where his whole argument gets really important. He was saying, just because you have a church building somewhere in a country doesn't automatically mean that every single group of people in that country is being reached in a way that makes sense to them, culturally speaking. Like, you could have churches in Pakistan, but that doesn't mean the 97% of the population who are Muslim are actually hearing the gospel in a way that connects with their worldview and their background. And that's where he said the traditional approach of what he called near neighbor evangelism, or what he labeled E1, falls short.
Okay, E1, got it. So to understand these different levels of outreach, Winter created this framework, right? Can you break down these E1, E2, and E3 types of evangelism for us? How he defined them originally.
Sure thing. Now, Winter often used the example of the Aonag people in India to explain this, so let's stick with that. So picture this E1 evangelism as basically like one Aonaga person sharing their faith with another Aonaga person. Same language, same culture, pretty straightforward. It's the most natural kind of evangelism and usually the most effective because there's really no cultural barrier to overcome.
Makes sense. Someone who speaks your language, understands your customs, it's got to be more impactful than some outsider coming in, I'd imagine. So what makes E2 different then?
So E2 evangelism, that's where you start crossing a language or a cultural boundary. But the difference is it's still a boundary where there are some similarities, some common ground. Like with Winter's Aonaga example, imagine an Aonaga reaching out to the Sandam Naga tribe. They might speak a related language or have some shared cultural roots. Or another example he used was Taiwan, like a Mandarin-speaking Christian, sharing their faith with someone who speaks Minam Taiwanese. It's definitely a step up in difficulty because even though there's some common ground, there are still differences, right? You got to be more intentional, use different ways of communicating.
Gotcha. So more hurdles to jump over, but still some kind of shared understanding to build on. And then E3, that sounds like the biggest leap of all.
Exactly. E3 evangelism, now that's when you're talking about crossing a major cultural and linguistic divide. Imagine that Ionaga person trying to share the gospel with someone who speaks Telugu from a totally different part of India. No shared language, no shared cultural heritage, totally different worldviews. Or think about Winter's own experience. He was an English speaker, right? So for him to reach a Navajo person, for example, that would be E3. It takes a ton of effort learning a new language, understanding a whole different way of seeing the world, adapting to totally different customs. The level of cross-cultural understanding you need is just, well, it's massive.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, the different levels of challenge involved in reaching different people. And Winter didn't just give these definitions, he gave real-world examples too, like Pakistan. What was he trying to show with that example?
Pakistan's a great example of what we were just talking about. I mean, sure, there are Christian communities in Pakistan, but they're not what you call culturally close to the vast majority of the population who are Muslim. You've got history, social factors, cultural differences. All these things create huge barriers. So even though Christians and Muslims might live in the same country in Pakistan, effective E1 evangelism, from those existing Christian communities to the Muslim population, it's just really difficult. That cultural gap is just too wide.
So being in the same country, same geographical location, it's not enough if you're worlds apart culturally. What about the Church of South India? That one seemed to show a different kind of barrier, even within the church itself.
Yeah, the Church of South India, that's a really fascinating example. So you've got this large, well-established Christian denomination, right? But here's the thing. A whopping 95% of its members came from just 5 out of over 100 different social classes or castes in India. What that tells you is if they're just doing regular internal evangelism, that E1 level stuff, well, they're mainly just reaching people within those same 5 social groups. The other 95 castes, pretty much untouched. So even though it's the same country, same language, to reach those other groups, you got to be intentional about crossing these social and cultural barriers. It's like doing E2 within your own nation.
Man, that really shows how complex it can be. It's like even in a single country, those deep-rooted social structures can create these cultural distances that are just as big as any geographical distance.
Right.
And then there was the Batak Church in northern Sumatra. That one showed another interesting angle, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Batak Church, they were incredibly successful at reaching other Bataks. Classic example of E1 evangelism working like a charm. But then when they tried to reach other Indonesian groups, different languages, different cultures, they hit a wall. It was like their success within their own group didn't automatically translate to reaching people outside of it. They needed a whole different approach, something more like E2 or even E3 to bridge that cultural gap.
I see. And then the Church of Nagaland, that one was like a case study in how those different E-levels can play out in a single region.
You got it. The story of the Church of Nagaland, it's like a step-by-step guide to this whole thing. First, you have American missionaries coming in and reaching the Ionaga people. For those missionaries, that was probably a major E3 undertaking. Then the Ionagas start sharing the gospel among themselves. E1, no problem, it works great. Then they start reaching out to other Naga tribes nearby who speak similar languages and have some cultural similarities. That's E2. And then finally, the real challenge comes trying to reach all those other language groups in the rest of India. That's E3, even though they're all technically in the same country. It really shows you that just being in the same place geographically doesn't mean you've bridged those cultural and linguistic divides.
It's fascinating how it's not always about the miles on the map, right?
Yeah.
And then Taiwan and Japan, they added another layer to this whole thing, showing that language isn't the only barrier.
Exactly. Like in Taiwan, you can see a pretty clear distinction between E1, E2, and E3. Just based on language, you've got Mandarin, Minnan, and Hakka, and all those Aboriginal languages. But then you look at Japan, and it's like, even though everyone pretty much speaks the same language, there are all these other differences. Social class, business culture, deep-seated social norms. And those things can create these invisible barriers, these E2 spheres, that are really hard to break into.
It's like sometimes the cultural distance is more about unspoken rules and deeply held values than it is about words. And then, of course, there's Winter's own experience in Guatemala. Dealing with English, Spanish, and Mayan languages all at the same time must really brought this whole idea to life for him.
Oh, without a doubt. He saw it firsthand, those varying degrees of cultural distance. Like when he talked to another English speaker, that was E1, easy peasy. With the Spanish-speaking Guatemalan, there was a bit more of a cultural gap closer to his own European background, so more like E2. But then when he interacted with an indigenous person speaking a Mayan language, whoa, that was a whole different ballgame. E3 all the way.
So, with all these examples showing how this all works in the real world, Winter then turns to the Bible, right? Specifically Acts 1.8. How did he interpret that passage in light of this whole idea of cultural distances?
Well, he took a really interesting approach. He said that when Jesus gave that command, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth," it wasn't meant to be understood purely geographically. He believed the main point Jesus was making was actually about these increasing levels of cultural distance. And the key example he uses is Samaria. Geographically, Samaria was right next door to Judea, but culturally, totally different world. Jews and Samaritans did not get along.
Oh, yeah. The story of the woman at the well really illustrates that. Jesus basically crossed a cultural battle line just to talk to her.
Exactly. He went out of his way to engage with her, even though there were all these cultural taboos against it. He focused on her needs, her heart, her individual story. And, the disciples, they were totally thrown by it. They just couldn't understand why he would even talk to her. And then, of course, you have Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. He didn't force them to follow all the Jewish customs like circumcision. It's like he was saying the message is more important than the cultural baggage.
That's really thought-provoking. And then Winter makes this crucial distinction between cultural distance and prejudice. Why is that so important?
It's a really key point. Prejudice, that's basically when you have these prejudgments about people, negative stereotypes. And yeah, that can create huge problems when you're trying to reach out to people. But cultural distance, it's different. It's not necessarily about hatred or ill will. It's about these differences in worldview and understanding that can lead to miscommunication and difficulty connecting. Like, think about the Samaritans again. They probably faced a lot more outright prejudice from the Jews than, say, someone from Greece who was completely different religiously and culturally. But that Greek person, because their worldview was so different, they were actually at a much greater cultural distance from a Jew than a Samaritan was. Winter used this analogy, said it's like a Protestant in America might understand a Catholic a lot better, even if they disagree on some things, because they share a common cultural background. But they might actually experience less prejudice from a Hindu person, even though that Hindu person is culturally way further removed.
So basically, bridging cultural distance is about understanding and adapting, while overcoming prejudice is about confronting those deep-seated biases and stereotypes. Both are important, but they're different challenges.
Exactly. And this whole idea of cultural distance versus prejudice, it feeds directly into Winter's argument about E1 and E3 evangelism.
Right. He basically says that E1, sharing your faith with someone from your own culture is the most powerful way to do it when it's possible. Like hearing the gospel in your own language from someone who really understands your culture, that's got to be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. There's this immediate connection, this resonance that you just can't get when those cultural and linguistic barriers are there. But Winter also makes this really strong point. He says, E1 is impossible in a new people group unless someone has already done the hard work of cross-cultural evangelism. That E2 or E3 outreach that establishes a Christian presence in that group. Someone has to go out and bridge that initial cultural gap before anyone from within that group can start sharing their faith effectively.
So it's like you need that initial spark, that cross-cultural bridge building, before the fire can really spread within a culture. And that brings us to this term Winter coined, people blindness. That's a powerful term. What does he mean by that?
People blindness, it's this really dangerous oversight, this failure to see the incredible diversity within the world. Basically, it's when you look at a country on a map and think, okay, there's a church there, so everyone in that country is reached. But that's ignoring the fact that every country is made up of all these different people groups, each with their own unique language and culture. It's like in the Great Commission, when it says, go and make disciples of all nations, the word that's translated as nations, the Greek word ethne, it actually refers more to these distinct ethnic groups, these people groups, not just political countries. So the Great Commission is actually calling us to reach every single distinct people group, not just plant a church building in every country.
That's a huge distinction. It's like we can be so focused on the big picture that we miss all the individual details, all the unique stories and perspectives. And this people blindness, it has some pretty serious implications when we're talking about the sheer number of people who haven't heard the gospel, right?
Oh, absolutely. The stats Winter gives are pretty sobering. He estimated that back in 1974, at least 80% of non-Christians in the world were beyond the reach of any kind of natural E1 evangelism. And he even quoted some calculations that suggested nearly 2 billion people, 2 billion in Africa and Asia basically had zero access to a culturally relevant Christian witness. When you realize how widespread this people blindness is, it's like the enormity of the task just explodes.
It's easy to think, if you live in a country like the U.S., that missions is something that happens over there in faraway places. But Winter made a really compelling case that even in a country like the U.S., there's a huge need for E2 evangelism.
He did. He pointed out that even within the U.S., you have all these deep social and cultural divides. You think about the differences between a middle-class church in the suburbs and a working-class community in an urban center, or the incredible diversity of languages spoken here, or even back then, the whole countercultural movement with the Jesus people that required totally new forms of worship and expression to connect with them effectively. All those things represent E2-level cultural distances. And he even used the example of John Wesley in England, who went out and created new congregations specifically to reach groups like the coal miners, who just didn't feel at home in the traditional church.
So E2 evangelism, it's not always about going to a different country. Sometimes it's about crossing the street or crossing those invisible lines that divide us even within our own communities. And it often means being willing to step outside of our comfortable church structures and create new ways of doing church to reach people who don't fit in the existing mold.
Right, like think about Jesus and the Samaritan woman again. That was an E2 encounter. He crossed those cultural lines, and what happened? She went back to her own community and became this incredibly effective E1 witness. If he had tried to force her to conform to Jewish culture and join a Jewish synagogue, she probably wouldn't have had nearly the same impact.
And it's like, sometimes you got to meet people where they are, literally and figuratively, if you really want to connect with them. And of course, that brings up a big theological question that Winter tackles head on, the whole question of whether creating separate churches or ministries for different cultural groups is actually dividing the church.
Yeah, it's a huge question. But Winter's response is really interesting. He basically says that we shouldn't confuse Christian unity with uniformity. Like, the goal isn't to make everyone look and act exactly the same. The most important thing is to make the gospel message clear and understandable within each culture's unique framework. And sometimes that means not forcing people into a single, culturally bound expression of church.
And he uses this really memorable analogy, doesn't he? Something about an orchestra.
He does. It's brilliant. He says, imagine the global church as this huge symphony orchestra. Each section of the orchestra represents a different culture or people group. They're all playing from the same score, the Word of God, but they're each using their own unique instruments, their own cultural expressions and traditions. And the result is this incredible, rich, multi-layered sound that wouldn't be possible if everyone was forced to play the same instrument the same way.
I love that analogy. It really captures that idea of unity in diversity.
Yeah.
And what about the Apostle Paul? Did his ministry line up with this idea of culturally diverse expressions of faith?
Winter goes into some detail about Paul's example. He acknowledges that we don't have any explicit historical records of Paul setting up completely separate churches for different social groups like masters and slaves. But what we do see is Paul's willingness to change his approach drastically depending on who he was talking to. Like, he famously said he became all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. His way of interacting with Jews who were under the law was totally different from how he interacted with Gentiles who weren't. And in the book of Galatians, you have this whole situation where Jewish Christians were trying to force Gentile Christians to follow Jewish customs, like circumcision. And Paul was vehemently against it. He was fiercely defending the Galatians' right to live out their faith in our own cultural context, free from any kind of cultural imperialism.
So it wasn't about segregation or division. It was about freedom and authenticity, letting each culture express their faith in a way that made sense to them.
Exactly. And Winter emphasizes that recognizing the need for culturally relevant approaches isn't about creating some kind of hierarchy within the church. It's not about saying one culture's expression of faith is better than another. It's about acknowledging that all these different cultural traditions are equally valid and acceptable to God. When Paul said, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus," Winter's interpretation is that Paul wasn't calling for everyone to become culturally identical. He was affirming the inherent equality of our diversity.
It's like unity is not the same as uniformity, and this has some really practical implications for how we do ministry today, even in a world that's more connected than ever. Winter even touches on the debates about forming separate congregations based on language or social class in places like Los Angeles.
He does, and his view is consistent with everything else we've been talking about. He basically says that these decisions should come down to Christian freedom and strategic effectiveness. Like, the question isn't what should a church look like? The question is, what's going to be most effective in reaching the most people with the gospel in a way that they can understand? The goal is to make the message clear, not to enforce some rigid model of what church should be.
It's all about the outcome,
Yeah.
right? What actually works. And then he zeroes in on the challenge of reaching two of the largest unreached people groups in the world, Muslims and Hindus. What were his key insights there?
He pointed out something really important, that there's been a real lack of effective cross-cultural evangelism focused on Muslims and Hindus. Like he said, imagine a new convert from Islam in Pakistan. They're probably not going to feel very welcome or comfortable walking into a traditional Presbyterian church. The cultural differences and historical baggage are just too great. And in India, those deeply ingrained prejudices based on caste can make it almost impossible to reach certain social classes through traditional E1 evangelism. He did mention some cases where Muslims had become Christians without having to completely abandon their culture, which suggests that there's huge potential if we can find more culturally sensitive and appropriate ways to reach out to them. And he even suggested that in places like India, people from other regions or cultural backgrounds might actually be more effective at reaching certain groups than local Christians because they don't have those same social barriers to overcome.
It's almost like sometimes an outsider can see things more clearly or connect with people in a way that someone from within the culture can't.
Exactly. And Winter's main call to action was this. He said the absolute top priority for missions has to be developing cross-cultural knowledge and skills, learning how to engage effectively at that E2 and E3 level. He really believed that if we want to reach people who don't have access to a culturally relevant presentation of the gospel, we have to be willing to go more than halfway to bridge those cultural gaps.
Wow. That's a powerful challenge.
Yeah.
So, to sum up Winter's main points, it's not enough for the gospel to just exist in a country. It has to reach every distinct people group within that country. And to do that, we need to understand and use these different levels of evangelism, E1, E2, and E3. We have to get over our people blindness and see the world in all its complexity and diversity. And we need to be willing to step outside our comfort zones and be creative in our approaches, all while respecting the freedom and beauty of each culture's unique expression of faith.
Well said. Winter's 1974 address, it really challenged the way people thought about missions back then, and it's still incredibly relevant today. It gives us a framework for understanding the world and interacting with people from different cultures, not just in missions, but in any area of life.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive, and I think it raises some important questions for all of us.
It does. So, listener, we're going to leave you with this thought. How does Winter's framework challenge your own assumptions about outreach and engagement? Whether it's in your local community, across different social groups, or on a global scale, what cultural distances might exist that you haven't even noticed? And how could understanding and embracing diversity make you more effective in communicating and building relationships in every area of your life?
That's something to really chew on. The world is a big, complex, beautiful tapestry of different experiences and perspectives. And learning how to see and appreciate those differences is key to connecting with people and sharing meaningful insights no matter what you're talking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.